Rod Rosenstein has been looking into changing some of the policies in the White House in regard to spying on journalists, in particular journalists who are reporting based on sources who leaked information to them. Now, Trump's White House has been notorious for leaking information to reporters, and Trump has never really been able to stop these leaks from happening. So as a result, it appears, based on reporting by The Hill, John Solomon at The Hill, Rod Rosenstein was looking into lowering the bar in order to have administration officials spy in on journalists. So the Department of Justice quietly has been working on a revision of its guidelines governing how, when, and why prosecutors can obtain the records of journalists, particularly in leak cases. The work has been supervised by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein's office. Now, let me tell you how the current system works and what Trump's administration would like to switch it to. So the current system requires prosecutors, in most cases, to exhaust all obvious investigative methods for identifying leaks before seeking to intrude on a journalist's free speech rights. Because as you know, journalists are protected by the First Amendment, and a good journalist is not going to automatically give up his or her source just because there's pressure from the White House. So there are certain protections for the journalists, and it's important to maintain that so they can get the news to the American people, so they can be informed and make the right decision for themselves when they go out there to vote. Now, in addition, the rules generally have required DOJ to alert news organizations in advance of a possible subpoena, giving both sides a chance to negotiate before the subpoena. So that's another important part of this, right? Okay, well, before we go to the nuclear option of a subpoena, let's see if we can negotiate this and figure out what's going on. Now, here's what the DOJ wants to do. The ongoing DOJ review has two main goals. The first is to lower the threshold that prosecutors must meet before requesting subpoenas for journalist records. The second is to eliminate the need to alert a media organization that justice intends to issue a subpoena. Now, they have not finalized these guidelines. In fact, it's actually unclear as to whether or not they will finalize these guidelines. But if they do, it would be bad for journalists who are reporting based on White House aides leaking information to them.
So I hope that I'm not nitpicking here when I read you a sentence from The Hill, which I think is problematic. Because we do read The Hill, and John Solomon works there, and he was targeted by Mueller and the FBI, and wrote a wonderful piece. But they, in explaining the Trump position in this issue, they say that they also contend that the current rules treat journalists as a special class whose First Amendment rights are elevated above those of other Americans, something they don't believe the founding fathers intended. Well, then they had a curious way of showing it, because the First Amendment doesn't just say freedom of speech. It says freedom of speech and freedom of the press. In fact, the press, other than politicians, is the only profession mentioned in the United States Constitution. And yes, they are literally singled out in the First Amendment for extra rights. They have a freedom of the press. They bothered to say this particular occupation needs to be protected from the government. So you can repeat the Trump administration position, but you should put the next sentence in saying that is factually incorrect. Here's what the First Amendment actually says.
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think you're nitpicking a little bit. I mean, if I had written this piece, I wouldn't have thought to do that, and there's no ill intent. I just wouldn't think to do that. But real quick, the reason why the press is the, media, it's the only occupation that's mentioned in the Constitution, is because real journalism is not friendly to people in positions of power. And so as a result, a real journalist would be a target of politicians, corporate executives. The muckrakers back in the day that actually inspired me the most were those who would investigate wrongdoings by big business in America. And so, yeah, you need those protections to ensure that you don't have the government coming after journalists for simply doing their jobs and informing the people about what people in positions of power are doing.
What the founding fathers actually didn't foresee is that a corporate media would grow, and that corporate media would help the politicians and those in power to actually fight against real journalists. So for example, David Sirota the other day just pointed out, hey, Beto O'Rourke is the #2 recipient of oil and gas money in Congress. It's a fact, right? And you can make with that fact, you can say, hey, there's a reason for that. He's from Texas, et cetera, but he just tweeted out a fact. And NBC News sent in Alex Seitz-Wald, who used to work for Debbie Wasserman Schultz, et cetera, to write a hit piece about Bernie Sanders supporters are now pointing out facts about other people. So now, unfortunately, a lot of the mainstream media is used to attack real reporters who are trying to challenge power and politicians, et cetera. So that is actually what the Founding Fathers didn't see coming.
Now, there's a final component to this story that I wanted to share with all of you. William Barr is being considered as Trump's next attorney general. So the Senate held hearings to decide whether or not they would confirm him. And during an exchange with Senator Klobuchar, Barr was asked about what Rod Rosenstein is doing. And here was the reaction.
I know there are guidelines in place, and I can conceive of situations where, as a last resort, and where a news organization has run through a red flag or something like that, knows that they're putting out stuff that will hurt the country. There could be a situation where someone would be held in contempt.
So now that means, yeah, I'll jail journalists, definitely. There could be a situation where we are made uncomfortable by the press. Now, most of you are good boys and girls, and you don't make us uncomfortable, and we move forward, right? But if you reveal things that embarrass us, well, then obviously there's gonna be consequences. So that's a terrible answer by William Barr. And look, we are not partisan. We have a point of view, we're progressive, but we're not partisan. So I can tell you that Obama was terribly wrong on this issue. And he used the Espionage Act against reporters. So now it's become bipartisan consensus that, yeah, if a journalist reveals something that is uncomfortable to the people in power, you should consider putting them in jail. So Trump is happy to take that precedent and run with it. Now here's his nominee for Attorney General going, yeah, I might throw them in prison. The TYT Plus app is now available on iOS and Android. Download to get more TYT content at tyt.com/app.